At my husband's funeral, a woman I had never seen before placed a baby in my arms and whispered, "He's yours." Now I know that sounds almost impossible to believe, but it happened, and the memory of that moment has never left me. Before I tell you what unfolded that day, I want to ask something from you. Could you take a second to subscribe to my channel, Her Revenge Stories? And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'd love to see how far this story travels, because sometimes, knowing others are listening makes sharing something this personal a little easier. My name is Margaret, though most people just called me Maggie all my life. I'm 72 years old now, and I've carried this story like a stone in my pocket, something I've wanted to tell, but I never found the right words until recently. My husband, Richard, was a quiet man, private to a fault. We'd been married for over 40 years when he passed away, and as any long marriage goes, there were good times, hard times, and a lot of unspoken things in between. That morning of the funeral, the world felt heavy, as if the air itself knew what I had lost. I remember standing in front of the mirror, my hands trembling as I tried to pin a small silver brooch onto the lapel of my black jacket. My daughter, Ellen, had offered to come early to help me, but I insisted on doing it myself. I wanted that quiet space, just me and my thoughts, before I had to face everyone else. Grief has a way of making you crave solitude. By 10 o'clock, the house was full of relatives. My sister-in-law, Joan, was in the kitchen fussing with a tray of sandwiches no one would probably eat. My nephew was checking his phone every 2 seconds, clearly uncomfortable in the presence of so much sorrow. I noticed these things not because they mattered but because when you're grieving, your mind latches onto details to avoid the larger, unbearable picture. The church was only a few blocks away, and we arrived in a caravan of cars. I remember the way the bells tolled as we walked inside, their sound cutting through the morning like a knife. I had been to funerals before, friends, neighbors, but nothing prepared me for the weight of walking behind Richard's casket. My legs felt hollow like they might give out beneath me, but somehow I kept moving. People spoke kind words, of course. They always do. He was such a gentleman. He always had a smile. You were lucky to have him. And I nodded, smiled weakly, thanked them. But inside I kept thinking of the nights we spent in silence at opposite ends of the living room. Him reading his newspaper, me knitting, the gulf between us widening as the years went on. It wasn't that I didn't love him. I did, but there were questions I never asked, things I never understood about the man I shared my life with. It was during the reception afterward that everything changed. The fellowship hall was crowded with people holding paper plates of food, balancing cups of weak coffee, and offering condolences that blurred together like a hum. I stood near the corner trying to catch my breath when I noticed her. She was younger than me by at least 20 years. Her dark hair pulled into a neat bun, her dress simple but elegant. She didn't look like anyone from Richard's side of the family, nor from mine. And yet there was something in the way she scanned the room, almost nervously, that drew my attention. She approached slowly, as if gathering courage with every step. When she reached me, she didn't introduce herself. Instead, she shifted the bundle in her arms, a baby wrapped in a soft blue blanket. The child stirred, his tiny fists clenched, his mouth searching for comfort. Without a word, she leaned forward and gently placed him into my arms. The weight of that baby, warm, fragile, real, was shocking. I looked up at her, confused, my mouth open but no words coming out. And that's when she leaned close, her lips almost brushing my ear, and whispered, "He's yours." Then just as quickly she straightened, her eyes flicking toward the exit. Before I could stop her, before I could even form a question, she turned and slipped into the crowd. By the time I found my voice and tried to follow, she was gone. I stood frozen, the baby cradled against me, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Around me, no one seemed to notice what had just happened. People were laughing softly at some memory, the clink of coffee cups and forks on paper plates filling the air, as if nothing in the world had changed. But for me, everything had. The baby squirmed, a soft whimper rising in his throat. Instinctively, I adjusted him against my shoulder, rocking slightly the way I used to with my own children decades ago. His warmth seeped into me, his breath tickling my neck, and for a fleeting moment, it felt natural, almost comforting. But then the weight of her words came back. He's yours. What did she mean? Was she speaking metaphorically, as in take care of him? Or was she telling me something else, something about Richard? The thought struck me so hard I nearly dropped the child. My Richard, the man I thought I knew better than anyone, had secrets. I always suspected there were corners of his life he never shared with me. Little shadows in his stories, gaps in his explanations. But a baby? A child this young? At his age? It didn't seem possible, and yet the whisper echoed in my ears, refusing to let me dismiss it. I tried to find Ellen, my daughter, to explain what had happened, but when I spotted her across the room surrounded by her cousins, I froze. How could I tell her? How could I even begin to explain what I was holding in my arms? Instead, I slipped out of the crowded hall into the hallway, needing air, space, anything to help me think. The baby had quieted now, his tiny face pressed into my shoulder, as if he trusted me completely. That trust cut through me like a knife. I lowered myself onto a bench near the entrance, my knees trembling. I studied his features, soft cheeks, a button nose, a small tuft of dark hair. Did he look like Richard? Did he look like me? I couldn't tell. Maybe I didn't want to. A man passing by smiled at me, assuming I was simply holding a grandchild. I forced a smile back, nodding, playing along. My mind raced with questions. Who was that woman? Why would she hand me her baby? Why at Richard's funeral, of all places? And what did she mean, he's yours? For the next hour I sat there, clutching the baby, hoping she would return, that she would explain, that I wouldn't be left with nothing but questions. But she never did. People trickled out, offering last hugs and kind words. My relatives gathered their coats, ready to leave. Ellen finally approached me, concern in her eyes. "Mom, whose baby is that?" she asked, her voice a mix of curiosity and alarm. I opened my mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Ellen's question hung in the air between us, heavy and impossible to answer. I looked down at the baby, his tiny eyelids fluttering as he drifted into a soft sleep against my chest, and then back up at my daughter's worried face. My mouth felt dry, as though any explanation would come out cracked and broken. I don't know, I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. Her brows knitted together. "What do you mean you don't know? You're holding a baby, Mom. Whose child is this?" I glanced around, hoping that mysterious woman might reappear, might save me from the confusion clawing at my insides. But the hallway was empty except for a few stragglers gathering their coats. The fellowship hall echoed faintly with the sound of chairs scraping and voices fading. She was gone. "A woman handed him to me," I said at last. She said he was mine." Ellen's eyes widened, her mouth parting as though she hadn't heard me right. Then she let out a short, incredulous laugh. "That doesn't make any sense. Who was she? Did you recognize her?" I shook my head slowly. "No. I've never seen her before." My daughter pressed a hand to her forehead, exhaling sharply. "Mom, are you sure you're not just maybe confused? It's been such a long day. People say things when they're grieving, they do strange things. Maybe she meant—" "I know what she said," I cut in, sharper than I intended. Ellen flinched slightly and guilt washed over me. I softened my tone. "I'm sorry, but I'm not mistaken. She handed me this baby and whispered, 'He's yours.'" Then she left. The words seemed absurd even as I repeated them, and yet I knew exactly how they had sounded, the urgency in her voice, the finality. Ellen leaned closer, studying the baby as if the answer might be etched into his tiny features. "Well, what do we do now?" That was the question, wasn't it? What did one do when a stranger left a baby in their arms at their husband's funeral? My entire life had been built around predictability. Raising children, cooking dinners, caring for Richard, volunteering at the library. Now, in one afternoon, everything had tilted sideways, leaving me standing on unfamiliar ground. "I suppose we wait," I murmured. "Maybe she'll come back for him." But she didn't. We waited until the last guest had gone, until the custodians began folding chairs and sweeping crumbs from the floor. Ellen paced back and forth, her phone in her hand, threatening to call the police. I sat frozen on the bench, clutching the baby tighter, afraid of what would happen if I let go. Finally, Ellen crouched in front of me. Mom, we can't just take him home without telling anyone. This isn't safe. He could be, well, I don't even know. There are laws, responsibilities. Her practical words cut through my fog. She was right, of course. We couldn't simply walk out with him as though he were a forgotten purse or coat. But part of me recoiled at the idea of handing him over to strangers. He was innocent, helpless. And the way he had settled so naturally into my arms made it feel as though he belonged there. Just give me a little more time, I pleaded. Please. Ellen hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. All right. But we have to figure this out tonight. By the time we left the church, the sky had deepened into shades of gold and purple. I rode in the back seat with the baby nestled against me, while Ellen drove silently, glancing at me through the rearview mirror every few minutes. The hum of the car, the warmth of his tiny body, lulled me into a strange calm. For the first time since Richard's death, I didn't feel completely empty. At home, Ellen prepared a makeshift bed for the baby out of a laundry basket lined with blankets. I watched as she worked, surprised by her competence, her quiet efficiency. She had always been the practical one, the planner, the worrier. And here she was, turning my guest room into a nursery in under 10 minutes. We laid him gently into the basket, and he stirred, whimpering softly before settling back into sleep. Ellen stood with her arms crossed, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and suspicion. Mom, she said carefully, do you think Dad had something to do with this? Her words hit me like a slap. I opened my mouth, closed it again. I wanted to dismiss the thought immediately, to say of course not, to protect Richard's memory. But deep down a small uneasy voice whispered that it wasn't impossible. I don't know, I admitted, my throat tight. I really don't. Silence stretched between us. Ellen finally sighed, rubbing her temples. I'll make some tea. Maybe it'll help us think. When she left the room, I sat beside the basket, staring at the baby's peaceful face. His tiny fingers curled and uncurled in sleep. I tried to imagine Richard holding him. Imagine him living a secret life I knew nothing about. My stomach twisted. If it were true, then what had my 40 years of marriage been built on? The sound of the kettle whistling carried down the hall, followed by the clink of cups. Ellen returned with steaming mugs, setting one beside me. She lowered herself into a chair, her face drawn. We need to call someone, she said softly. The police, child services, I don't know. This isn't something we can handle on our own. I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the warmth seep into my skin. Just one night, I whispered. Give me one night to think, to hold him. Tomorrow we'll do what we must. Ellen studied me for a long moment, then nodded reluctantly. One night. We sat in silence, sipping tea, listening to the baby's even breathing. Outside, crickets chirped in the cooling air. The house felt different with him in it, as though it had been waiting for this unexpected guest all along. Later, when Ellen went to bed, I stayed behind. I couldn't bring myself to leave him alone in the basket. Instead, I lifted him gently into my arms, rocking in the old chair by the window. Moonlight spilled across the floor, silver and soft. As I held him, I whispered to the quiet room, though I wasn't sure who I was speaking to. Richard, the mysterious woman, or myself? Who are you, little one? And why did she choose me? The baby stirred, his eyes fluttering open for a moment. He gazed up at me with a look so clear, so trusting that my chest ached. I pressed my cheek to his soft hair, breathing in the sweet scent of milk and powder, and for the first time in days, I felt something other than grief. I felt alive that I didn't sleep that night. The house was too quiet, my mind too restless. I stayed in the chair by the window with the baby curled against my chest, drifting in and out of shallow dozes. Each time his little body shifted or his lips smacked in sleep, I stirred awake, heart leaping with a strange mix of fear and tenderness. At dawn, a thin strip of light edged its way past the curtains, casting the room in pale gold. The baby stretched, his small hands opening wide before curling again, and a soft sigh left his lips. I felt an unexpected swell of affection, the kind I hadn't felt since my own children were small. I carried him carefully into the kitchen, where Ellen was already at the table with her laptop open. She looked exhausted, her hair tied back hastily, her coffee untouched beside her. Her eyes lifted to meet mine, and she didn't need to say anything. Her expression was full of questions. "You stayed up all night," she said instead. "I couldn't leave him," I admitted. She rubbed her temples. "Mom, we can't go on like this. We need answers." I looked up the number for the local authorities. "We should call before things get complicated." I sat down across from her, shifting the baby gently. "And what do you think will happen if we do? They'll take him, put him in some foster home. He'll be just another case file on someone's desk." Her eyes softened, but she shook her head. "And what's the alternative? We keep him here, pretend nothing happened? That's not realistic. We don't even know his name, his medical needs, nothing." Her words cut through me, but I couldn't argue with the truth. Still, something inside me resisted letting go. All I'm asking for is a little more time. Just a few hours. Maybe that woman will come back. Maybe there's an explanation we haven't thought of.
Ellen sighed heavily. Fine.
But if nothing changes today, we make the call. Agreed. I nodded slowly, though my heart rebelled. We spent the morning in uneasy quiet. Ellen busied herself with chores, though I could see she was only distracting herself from worry. I sat in the living room, rocking the baby, humming lullabies I hadn't thought of in decades. The sound of my own voice surprised me, soothing, steady, the way it had once been when Ellen and her brother were small. Around mid-morning, the doorbell rang. My heart leapt, certain it was the woman come back to explain. But when Ellen opened the door, it was only Joan, my sister-in-law, carrying a casserole dish. "I thought you might not feel like cooking," she said gently, stepping inside. Her eyes fell on the baby immediately. "Well, who's this?" Ellen and I exchanged a quick, nervous glance. Before I could think of what to say, Joan stepped closer, peering at him with a smile. "One of the neighbor's grandkids, I assume?" "He's darling." "Yes," I said quickly, forcing a smile. "Just visiting for a little while." Joan nodded, satisfied, and set the dish on the counter. She didn't linger long, thank goodness, just offered her condolences again before leaving. But as soon as the door closed, Ellen turned to me, her jaw tight. "You see how quickly people notice? What happens when more relatives stop by? Or a neighbor comes asking? We can't keep spinning lies, Mom." I clutched the baby closer. "I'll think of something." But deep down I knew she was right. After Joan left, the weight of secrecy pressed heavier on me. Every sound outside, the mail truck, a neighbor's footsteps, made me tense, afraid someone would come asking questions I couldn't answer. I began to feel like a thief, hiding something precious that didn't belong to me. By noon, Ellen's patience had worn thin. "This isn't sustainable," she said firmly. "We're calling the police." I opened my mouth to argue when a knock sounded at the door. Not the tentative knock of a relative or friend, but sharp, deliberate. Ellen froze, her eyes wide. "Do you think?" she whispered. I stood, my heart pounding, the baby tucked securely in my arms. Ellen went to the door and opened it cautiously. A man stood on the porch, tall, with tired eyes and a suit that looked slightly rumpled. He held a leather satchel at his side and cleared his throat politely. "Mrs. Reynolds?" he asked. Ellen stepped aside, letting him in. He introduced himself as Mr. Carter, an attorney. "I'm sorry to intrude during such a difficult time," he said, his voice low and respectful. "But there are matters I was instructed to address upon your husband's passing." My stomach dropped. "Matters? Instructed?" The words carried a weight I wasn't ready for. I gestured for him to sit, though my legs felt unsteady beneath me. Mr. Carter opened his satchel and pulled out a thin folder. "Your husband left me certain documents to deliver, though he specified they should not be opened until after the funeral." Ellen's eyes darted to mine, full of suspicion. I adjusted the baby in my arms, my breath shallow. With deliberate care, Mr. Carter slid the folder across the table toward me. "I'll leave you to read them privately. But I must tell you, Mrs. Reynolds, your husband was very clear that this would explain a great deal." And with that, he stood, offering his condolences once more before taking his leave. The door clicked shut, leaving the house suddenly too quiet. Ellen's gaze fixed on the folder as though it might burst into flames. "Mom," she said slowly, "what do you think is in there?" I sank into a chair, the baby nestled in one arm, the folder heavy in the other hand. My fingers trembled as I traced the edge of the envelope. I didn't want to open it. I wasn't sure I could bear whatever truth lay inside. "Maybe answers," I whispered. We sat in silence for a long moment. Finally, Ellen reached over, her hand covering mine. "Open it," she urged softly. I took a deep breath and tore the seal. Inside were several pages of neatly typed words, and as my eyes skimmed the first lines, my heart stopped. "Margaret," it began. "If you are reading this, then I am gone. There is something I should have told you long ago, but I never found the courage. I hope in time you can forgive me." The room swayed. I clutched the paper tighter, forcing myself to continue. "I had a relationship many years ago before I met you, one that resulted in a child. I was young, foolish, and afraid, and I made choices I regret. Recently, circumstances brought me back into contact with that child, now grown. And she has a son. That boy is my grandson." My vision blurred with tears. Ellen gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "I wanted to tell you," the letter continued. "But I feared hurting you, feared shattering the life we built. Instead, I arranged for this letter, and for certain people to find you when the time was right. Please take care of him if he comes into your life. He is innocent and he is family." The words ended there, signed simply, "Richard." I lowered the letter slowly, my hands shaking. The baby stirred, as if sensing the storm raging inside me. Ellen stared at me, speechless. So it was true. The woman's whisper, the baby in my arms, the secrets Richard had carried all those years. It was all true. I pressed the papers to my chest, closed my eyes, and for the first time since the funeral, I let myself cry, not just for the man I had lost, but for the truths I never knew. The letter slipped from my trembling hands and fluttered onto the table. I couldn't bear to read it again, not yet. My chest felt tight, as though the air had been stolen from the room. Richard, my Richard, the man I thought I knew better than anyone, had carried this secret for decades. And now it sat in my arms, wrapped in a blanket with tiny fingers curling around my blouse. Ellen picked up the pages and read them again silently, her brows knit together. She looked so much like her father in that moment, serious, thoughtful, lips pressed thin when troubled, that my heart ached. When she finished, she placed the letter back on the table carefully, as though afraid it might break if she held it too roughly. "So he knew," she whispered. "He knew all along." I swallowed hard. He should have told me. All those years, he should have trusted me enough to tell me. Ellen shook her head, anger flashing in her eyes. "He betrayed you, Mom. He betrayed all of us. Keeping something like this, it's not just a mistake. It's a lie. A lifetime of lies." Her words struck me, but I couldn't let them settle. I stared down at the baby, who had fallen asleep again, his little breath steady against my chest. "He's just a child," I murmured. "None of this is his fault." "That doesn't change what Dad did," she said, her voice sharp. "It doesn't change the fact that he left us to deal with this mess." I closed my eyes, trying to steady my breath. Richard was gone. There would be no confrontation, no questions answered, no apologies spoken aloud. Only this letter, only these new responsibilities, only the ache of knowing I had lived beside a man I hadn't fully known. When I opened my eyes again, Ellen was pacing, her hands running through her hair. "We need to call someone. A lawyer. Maybe even the authorities. We can't just keep him here." Her voice rose with each word, and the baby stirred uneasily, letting out a small whimper. I rocked him gently, shushing him. "Please lower your voice. You're scaring him." She froze, staring at me. "Do you even hear yourself, Mom? You're already talking like he belongs here. Like he's part of us." I met her gaze, steady and calm. "He is part of us. Your father made mistakes, awful selfish mistakes, but this little boy is innocent. He's family. Flesh and blood." Ellen shook her head, tears welling in her eyes. "I can't do this right now. I can't just sit here and accept it." She grabbed her keys from the counter. "I'm going for a drive. Before I could protest, she was gone, the door closing firmly behind her. The silence that followed was thick, pressing in on me from all sides. I rocked the baby in my arms, listening to his soft breaths, feeling his warmth seep into my skin. Somewhere deep in my chest, beneath the hurt and the anger, a spark of something began to glow. Not joy, not exactly, but a fragile, unexpected hope. I carried him into the living room and sat down in Richard's old chair. The leather was worn smooth from years of use, his shape pressed into the cushions. I closed my eyes and imagined him there. His quiet chuckle, the way his hand would rest on mine during long evenings. I tried to reconcile that man with the one who had written the letter, who had hidden an entire family from me. "Why didn't you trust me?" I whispered aloud. "Why didn't you tell me?" Of course there was no answer. Only the steady tick of the clock on the wall and the baby's even breathing. As the hours passed, I found myself watching the child closely. His tiny features, the way his lips curled into a faint smile in his sleep, the strength of his grip when his fingers caught mine. It felt strange and yet familiar, like slipping into a role I thought I had long since left behind. By mid-afternoon, the doorbell rang again. My heart lurched and I rose carefully, still holding the baby. When I opened the door, a woman stood there, the same one from the funeral. Her eyes were red-rimmed, her face pale, but her posture was steady. "Mrs. Reynolds," she said softly, "I need to speak with you." I hesitated, torn between slamming the door and dragging her inside. Instead, I stepped aside and let her in. She glanced around nervously before settling on the couch. I sat across from her, the baby nestled securely against me. My voice came out sharper than I intended. "You owe me an explanation. Right now." She nodded slowly, clasping her hands in her lap. "My name is Linda. I was Richard's daughter." The word struck me like a physical blow. I gripped the arm of the chair, trying to steady myself. "His daughter?" "Yes," she said, her voice trembling. "From before he met you. My mother raised me alone. I only met him when I was in my 20s. He was kind but distant. We spoke every so often and he helped when he could, but he never told you. He said he didn't want to hurt you." My throat felt raw. "And this child?" She looked at the baby, her expression softening. "He's mine. My son. His name is Michael." I blinked, the world tilting beneath me. Why bring him to me? Why at the funeral? Her eyes filled with tears. "Because Richard told me you were the only person he trusted to care for him if anything happened. He said you had the strength, the heart. And I can't do it. I'm not in a place where I can take care of him. My life is a mess, and he deserves better." I shook my head, anger flaring. "You handed me a baby in the middle of a funeral. Do you understand what you've done? The confusion you've caused." Tears spilled down her cheeks. I didn't know what else to do. I panicked. I thought, maybe you'd understand. I stared at her, torn between fury and pity. Her pain was real, her desperation palpable. But the weight of her choices had landed squarely on my shoulders. "Why didn't you just come to me directly?" I asked quietly. She wiped her eyes. "Because I was ashamed. Because I thought you'd hate me. I didn't want to ruin your memory of him." My heart twisted. The truth was that memory was already ruined. Richard's secrets had cracked it wide open, leaving shards that would never fit neatly back together. We sat in silence for a long time, the baby shifting slightly in my arms. Finally Linda stood, her hands trembling. "I just wanted you to know. And I wanted to thank you for keeping him safe, even for a little while." She walked to the door, pausing briefly. "I'll come back tomorrow. We can talk more then." And just like that she was gone. I sank back into the chair, my mind spinning. Richard had a daughter. And that daughter had a son. My family had grown without me even knowing. The front door opened again and Ellen stepped inside. Her face still flushed from anger but calmer than before. She froze when she saw me sitting with the baby, the letter on the table, the silence heavy around us. "What happened?" she asked cautiously. I took a deep breath, my voice low but steady. "Her name is Linda. She's Richard's daughter. And this little boy, his name is Michael. He's our family, Ellen. Whether we like it or not." Ellen stood frozen in the doorway, her mouth slightly open, eyes darting between me, the baby, and the letter still lying on the table. For a moment she didn't move, as if she were rooted to the floor. Then she let out a shaky breath and walked slowly into the room. "You're saying," she began carefully, her voice trembling, "that little boy is Dad's grandson? Which means—" She trailed off, struggling to form the words. I nodded, my throat tight. "Which means he's your nephew. Your blood." She pressed a hand to her forehead, shaking her head in disbelief. "All these years and he never said a word. He never told us he had another child. I can't wrap my head around this." I couldn't either, not fully. My chest still ached with betrayal, but holding the baby, Michael, I couldn't deny the connection I felt. It wasn't his fault that Richard had lived a life of secrets. He was here now, alive and vulnerable, and somehow in my arms he felt like he belonged. Ellen paced the room, her voice rising. "So what happens now? Linda drops him here like a package and we're just supposed to raise him? Like nothing happened." "Nothing about this is simple," I said gently. "But he's family. He needs someone. I can't just hand him over to strangers." She stopped pacing, turned and stared at me with wide, incredulous eyes. "You're not serious, are you? You're 71 years old, Mom. You can't raise a baby. This isn't realistic." Her words stung, but I didn't flinch. "I'm serious. I'm not saying it will be easy, but I can't abandon him. Your father asked me in his own way. And now that I know the truth, I feel like I have no choice." Ellen groaned, throwing her hands into the air. "Of course you have a choice. You always have a choice. Don't make this sound like destiny. Dad made his mistakes, huge ones. We don't have to carry the consequences for him." I adjusted Michael against my shoulder, feeling his tiny breaths on my skin. "We already are," I whispered. For a long moment Ellen said nothing. She looked at me with something like pity, something like frustration. Finally, she sank into a chair across from me, her voice low and tired. "I just don't want to see you hurt more than you already are. Dad's death. It's enough to process. And now this. It's too much." I reached across the table, laying my hand over hers. "I know it's overwhelming. But Ellen, look at him. Really look." She hesitated, then glanced down at Michael. His little face was turned toward the light, his cheeks soft and pink, his eyelids fluttering in sleep. Something in her expression softened, though she quickly looked away. "I don't know if I can," she whispered. "That's all right," I said quietly. "You don't have to decide everything right this moment." The rest of the afternoon passed slowly, heavy with unspoken words. I fed Michael, changed him clumsily, rocked him when he fussed. Each small task pulled memories from the corners of my mind. Long nights with Ellen and her brother, Richard dozing on the couch while I paced the floor with a colicky baby. I hadn't thought I would ever hold a child again, not like this, not as a caretaker. And yet, as the hours slipped by, the motions returned, almost natural. As evening crept in, Ellen prepared a simple dinner neither of us really ate. The silence between us was thick, interrupted only by the baby's little noises. Finally, after clearing her plate untouched, she broke it. "What about Linda?" she asked suddenly. "Where does she fit into this? Is she just going to disappear and leave us to figure everything out?" I set my fork down. "She came by earlier while you were gone. She said she'll come back tomorrow, that we can talk more then."
Ellen scoffed.
"Convenient. She drops her child in your arms and then strolls back in when it suits her." "She's struggling," I said quietly. I don't know the details, but I could see it in her face. She's lost Ellen. And maybe she's made mistakes too, but she's still Richard's daughter. Which means she's your sister. Her face twisted with disbelief. "Don't say that. I can't just accept her as my sister." I met her gaze firmly. Family doesn't disappear because we wish it away. Whether we like it or not, she's a part of us now. Ellen stood abruptly, her chair scraping the floor. "I need air." She stepped outside onto the porch, leaving me alone again with Michael. The house was dim and quiet, shadows stretching long across the floor. I carried him into the living room and sat in Richard's chair once more. My fingers traced the worn leather, the faint indentations from years of his weight. I wondered how he had managed to live with this secret, to sit in this very chair with me at his side and never breathe a word. I whispered to the empty room, "You should have trusted me. You should have let me in." Michael stirred and opened his eyes wide and curious. They were a striking shade of blue, so much like Richard's had been when he was younger. The sight made my breath catch. For a moment it was as if I were staring into the past, into the man I'd first fallen in love with, full of promise and possibility. A tear slipped down my cheek. I pressed a kiss to Michael's forehead and held him close. Whatever anger I felt toward Richard, whatever bitterness lingered, none of it belonged to this child. He deserved better. He deserved safety, love, and a place to belong. When Ellen came back inside, she looked calmer, though her eyes were puffy from tears. She sat beside me, silent for a long time. Finally she spoke, her voice low. "I can't pretend I'm okay with this. I can't just flip a switch and accept it. But I see the way you're holding him, the way he looks at you. And I know deep down you won't let him go. So if you're going to do this, I'll try to stand with you." My eyes filled with tears again, but this time they carried relief. I reached for her hand, squeezing it tightly. "Thank you. That's all I could ask." She gave me a weak smile, then leaned in to look at Michael. For the first time, she reached out and brushed her fingers gently against his tiny hand. He grabbed onto her finger instantly, his grip surprisingly strong. Ellen's eyes widened, and something softened in her expression. "He's stronger than he looks," she whispered. "He is," I agreed. The clock on the mantel ticked softly as the three of us sat there, linked together by circumstance, by blood, by secrets neither of us had asked for. The night grew deeper, the house quiet except for the sound of the baby's breathing. I thought about how the day had begun, grief still raw, the weight of loss pressing down on me. And yet here I was cradling new life, new responsibility, and a future I hadn't imagined. My heart was torn between sorrow and hope, but in that moment, I knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever came next, I wouldn't let Michael face it alone. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Ellen had gone upstairs to lie down, her exhaustion clear, leaving me alone in the living room with Michael nestled against my chest. His little breaths rose and fell in a steady rhythm, comforting in their simplicity. I rocked him gently, letting my thoughts wander. The day had been a storm, grief, revelation, confrontation, but now in the stillness, I felt a fragile thread of peace. The weight of Richard's betrayal still pressed heavily on me. But there was also something new, something unexpected. Responsibility, yes. Fear, certainly. But also, strangely, a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. The front porch light flickered. A moment later, I heard footsteps on the wooden boards. My heart quickened. Ellen was upstairs, so it could only be one person. I opened the door cautiously, and there stood Linda, clutching her coat around her thin frame. "May I come in?" she asked softly. I stepped aside and nodded. "He's asleep," I whispered, motioning toward Michael. Her eyes softened as they landed on him, and she let out a shaky breath. "I wasn't sure you'd let me in after everything." I gestured toward the chair across from me. "We need to talk." She sat down, her hands trembling as she twisted them together in her lap. "I know I've thrown your life into chaos, and I'm sorry, but I didn't know where else to go. My mother, well, she's not in the picture. And I thought, maybe Dad would have wanted you to know. To step in." Her voice cracked and tears filled her eyes. "I've been carrying this alone for so long. I thought I could do it. But when things got worse, when the rent notices kept coming and the cupboards were empty, I realized I couldn't. Michael deserves better than this. Better than me." The raw honesty in her words caught me off guard. I wanted to be angry with her, to blame her for keeping secrets, but looking at her, young, worn down, barely holding herself together, I couldn't. She was Richard's daughter. Yes, but she was also just a woman lost in circumstances she didn't know how to manage. "You don't think you can give him what he needs?" I said quietly. She shook her head, tears slipping down her cheeks. "Not right now. Maybe someday. But right now I can't even keep the lights on. And he needs someone who can show up every day. Someone steady. I looked down at Michael, his tiny hand curled against my sweater. The thought of handing him back, of letting him leave with her, filled me with dread. But I also couldn't ignore her pain. Linda, I began, my voice steady. If you want him to stay here, I'll do it. I'll take care of him. But you have to understand, it won't erase the past. Richard kept you hidden from us, and that wound won't heal overnight. Still, Michael, he deserves family. If you trust me with him, I'll love him like my own. Her breath hitched, and she pressed a hand to her mouth. For a long moment she said nothing. Then she whispered, "Thank you. I don't deserve your kindness, not after everything, but thank you." We sat in silence, the air thick with unspoken grief. Finally she stood. "I should go. I'll come back tomorrow, bring some of his things. Clothes, toys. If that's all right." I nodded. "That's fine." At the door she paused, her back to me. "I know you're angry at Dad. I am too. But for what it's worth, I think he loved you. Even if he didn't show it the way he should have." The words stung, but I didn't reply. After she left, I locked the door and returned to the chair, staring at the baby who had changed the course of my life in a single day. Upstairs, I heard the creak of the floorboards. Ellen appeared in the doorway, her eyes red from crying. Was that her? I nodded. She came to explain. "She's struggling, Ellen. More than we knew." Ellen crossed her arms tightly. "And she left him again, didn't she? She thinks it's best for now." She let out a bitter laugh. "Of course she does. Walks away from her child and expects us to pick up the pieces." "She's not walking away forever," I said firmly. "She's trying to survive." Ellen shook her head, pacing the room. "I don't know if I can forgive Dad. Or her. But..." She looked at Michael, her expression softening again despite her anger. "I can't take it out on him. He didn't ask for any of this." I stood and walked over, offering him into her arms. She hesitated, then carefully took him, holding him close. He stirred, blinking up at her with curious eyes. For the first time that day Ellen smiled, a real unguarded smile. He's beautiful," she whispered. "He is," I agreed softly. For a long while we just stood there. The three of us connected by loss and by something new, fragile and uncertain. As the night deepened, Ellen carried Michael upstairs and laid him gently in the crib we had hastily set up in the spare room. I lingered at the doorway, watching her tuck the blanket around him, her movements careful, protective. When she turned to me, her eyes shimmered with tears. "You're right, Mom. We can't abandon him. He's family. No matter how he got here." I reached for her hand, squeezing it tight. "We'll figure it out together." The day had begun with grief and ended with a fragile sense of unity I hadn't thought possible. Life had changed in a single whisper at the funeral, but as I watched my daughter stand beside the crib of her half-brother's son, I realized change didn't have to mean the end. Sometimes it was the beginning. The house had gone still again after Ellen and I left the nursery. We stood in the hallway for a moment, both of us listening to the soft rhythm of Michael's breathing. Then Ellen gave my hand a squeeze and whispered, "Get some rest, Mom. I'll check on him if he stirs." I nodded, though I knew sleep wouldn't come easily. My mind was too full of Richard, of Linda, of the baby who had arrived in my life like a storm but somehow calmed something in me I hadn't realized was restless. I returned to my bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the empty space where Richard used to sleep. The pillow was still faintly indented, the sheets cool and untouched. For so many years we had shared this room, this life, and I had believed I knew him. Now every memory felt cracked, fragile. But grief has a way of teaching us that people are never just one thing. Richard had been a husband, a father, a man of flaws and secrets. And now, because of him, there was Michael. I lay back, listening to the faint creaks of the old house, until at last my eyes closed. Sometime later I stirred to the sound of soft crying. Not Michael's, it was deeper, muffled. I slipped on my robe and followed the sound down the hallway. Ellen was sitting on the floor outside the nursery, her knees pulled up to her chest, her face buried in her arms. I sat beside her, resting a hand on her shoulder. She looked up, her eyes wet and tired. "I can't stop thinking about Dad, about how he lied to us. All the birthdays, the holidays, the moments he was here in this house while she and her baby were somewhere else. How could he live like that? I didn't have an answer, but I spoke softly. Sometimes people hide because they're ashamed, or afraid, or because they think they're protecting us when really they're only protecting themselves. She shook her head. I don't want to hate him, Mom. I really don't. But tonight I do. And I hate myself for that. I pulled her into a hug, holding her tightly. Feel what you need to feel. Anger, grief, confusion. It's all part of it. But hate won't last. It can't. Love has a way of outlasting even the worst truths. We stayed there until her tears quieted. Then together we slipped into the nursery. Michael was awake, his tiny hands moving restlessly, his eyes wide and curious. Ellen lifted him carefully, her earlier tears giving way to a small smile. Hi there, she whispered. You don't even know the mess you've caused, do you? I laughed softly, stepping closer to stroke his cheek. Maybe he'll be the one to mend it. We carried him downstairs, unwilling to let the night close in around us. In the living room I lit the lamp, and the warm glow filled the space. Ellen curled onto the sofa with Michael, while I sat across from her. Do you think Linda will come back tomorrow? She asked. She said she would, I replied. But even if she doesn't, we'll be ready. He has a place here now. Ellen nodded slowly, gazing down at him. It's strange. Just this morning I didn't even know he existed. And now I can't imagine walking away. Neither could I. The thought of returning to the quiet emptiness I'd braced myself for after Richard's death felt unbearable now. Life had handed me a cruel twist, but in it was also a gift. A chance to love again, to give again even when I thought those doors had closed. The hours stretched into the early morning, though we didn't notice. We talked quietly about practical things, cribs and bottles, doctors and papers, but also about bigger things. About family. About forgiveness. About how secrets can shape us, but they don't have to define us. At one point Ellen looked at me and said, I don't think Dad would have wanted it to end this way. With us angry at him, with his memory stained. I sighed. No, probably not. But he made his choices. Now we have to decide what to do with them. She tilted her head, studying me. And what do you want to do, Mom? I thought for a long moment. I want to love this child. I want to give him stability, warmth, and family. I want to show Linda that even though Richard kept her in the shadows, she doesn't have to live there anymore. And I want to teach you, Ellen, that our hearts can expand even when they're broken. Maybe especially then. Tears shimmered in her eyes again, but this time they didn't fall. She nodded, holding Michael closer. Then we'll do it together. The words settled over me like a blanket, comforting and sure. As dawn crept in, pale light slipping through the curtains, I realized the day that had begun with grief had ended with something entirely different. Not resolution, not yet, but hope. Fragile, tentative hope. I rose and went to the window, watching the horizon shift from gray to soft pink. Behind me, Ellen hummed softly to Michael, rocking him gently. The scene filled me with a quiet peace I hadn't expected to find. Not today, not so soon. Richard's absence was still sharp, his secret still heavy. But life had a way of filling the spaces we thought would remain empty forever. A whisper at a funeral had shattered the world I knew, but it had also opened a door. And standing there in the first light of morning, I chose to walk through it. I turned back, taking in the sight of my daughter and my husband's grandson together. My heart swelled, not with bitterness, but with the fierce certainty that love, however complicated, had found its way back into our lives. And I knew then with absolute clarity that no matter what tomorrow brought, we would face it as a family.